A sitting US president, under pressure, being asked a simple but serious question, and instead of answering calmly, he completely loses control. Not just frustration, not just deflection, a full meltdown. And the question is, why? What pushed Donald Trump to react the way he did during his interview with Norah O'Donnell on 60 Minutes? Was it the topic? Was it the pressure? Or was it something deeper, something he didn't want to confront? Because this all started after a shocking and chaotic night at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, a night that was already filled with tension, fear, and confusion. But what happened next turned everything into something much bigger. Let's break this down step by step so you can clearly understand what really happened. During the interview, Norah O'Donnell brought up a disturbing detail from a shooter's manifesto, a document that allegedly contained references to high-level government officials. Now, whether you agree with discussing it or not, it was relevant to the situation. It was part of the story, and it raised serious concerns. So naturally, she asked the question. But the reaction she got was explosive. Instead of addressing the issue calmly, Donald Trump immediately turned defensive, then aggressive. He didn't just deny the claims, he attacked the question itself. He called the media horrible people. He interrupted repeatedly, and he even went as far as calling the question a disgrace. Think about that for a second. A journalist asks about a document tied to a violent incident, and instead of focusing on the facts, the conversation turns into a personal attack. Why? Because sometimes the strongest reactions come when someone feels exposed, and that's where things start to get interesting. Because here's the key detail. The manifesto didn't specifically name one person in a clear, direct way, but the moment the accusations were read out loud, Trump instantly assumed it was about him. He jumped in. He denied everything before even being asked directly. And that raises a powerful question. Why respond so quickly unless you feel targeted? This is where many observers say the reaction itself becomes part of the story. Because in high-pressure moments, people don't just reveal what they think, they reveal what they fear. But this wasn't the only moment that stood out, because the interview also touched on what happened the night before, during the White House Correspondents' Dinner, a moment that was supposed to be formal, controlled, and secure. But instead, it turned into chaos. Shots were reportedly fired, security rushed in, and in the middle of it all, the president ended up on the ground. Now here's where the story splits into two versions. Trump's version, in what people actually saw. According to Trump, he didn't fall. He said Secret Service agents told him to go down. He claimed it was a precaution, a safety move, something controlled. But the footage tells a different story. It shows confusion, movement, and a sudden fall. And this small detail became a huge talking point. Because it's not just about falling, it's about control of the narrative. In moments like this, perception matters. Because people aren't just watching what happens, they're watching how it's explained. And when those two things don't match, trust starts to break. This is why the incident quickly spread across media platforms. People began asking questions, not just about the event, but about the response. And here's another important layer to this story: political violence. Because during the interview, Trump was also asked a broader question, a serious one. What can be done to reduce violence in America? Now this was a moment where leadership matters, a moment to unify, a moment to acknowledge the issue. But instead, the answer shifted. Rather than focusing on solutions, Trump pointed blame. He suggested that the problem was caused by political opponents. Specifically, he blamed Democrats. Now whether you agree or disagree, the key takeaway here is not just what was said, but what wasn't said. There was no clear plan, no direct solution, no acknowledgement of responsibility. And that left many people wondering, is this about solving problems or controlling narratives? And this brings us to a deeper point. Because throughout this entire situation, from the interview, to the dinner, to the aftermath, there's one pattern that keeps repeating: deflection, attack, reframe. Instead of addressing concerns directly, the focus shifts. Instead of answering questions, the questions are challenged. And instead of calming the situation, it becomes more intense. But here's where it gets even more surprising. Because after all the tension, after the confrontation, after the chaos, the tone suddenly changes. At the end of the interview, something unexpected happens. The same journalist who was called a disgrace thanks the president, appreciates him for attending the event, even suggests doing it again. And that moment confused a lot of people, because it raises another question. Was this real accountability, or just access politics? And this is where the story takes a turn, because what happened next, and how people reacted, reveals something much bigger than just one interview. It exposes how media, power, and public perception all collide in real time. And trust me, what comes next only gets more intense. because there are details, reactions, and statements that completely change how you see this entire situation. And once you hear them, you won't look at this the same way again. Now, before we move forward, take a second and think about this. What happens when the media, the people who are supposed to question power, suddenly start protecting it? Because what unfolded after that intense interview wasn't just about one man's reaction. It became a story about something much bigger, a story about how narratives are shaped, controlled, and sometimes completely flipped. Right after the interview aired on 60 Minutes, reactions started pouring in, and you would expect a moment like this, a heated exchange, accusations, visible tension to spark serious criticism, but instead, something unusual happened. A large part of the mainstream media didn't focus on the meltdown, they didn't focus on the accusations, they didn't even focus on the contradictions. Instead, they praised Donald Trump. Yes, praised him for attending the White House Correspondents' Dinner, for showing up, for lowering the temperature. Now pause for a second. Does that make sense? Because just hours earlier, this same president was calling a journalist a disgrace on national television. He was interrupting, he was attacking, he was visibly angry, and yet somehow, that became a story of leadership. This is where things start to feel disconnected. Because when reality and narrative don't match, people start asking questions, and one of the biggest questions here is simple. Who controls the story? Is it the footage we all saw, or is it the way it's presented afterward? Let's go back to the dinner for a moment. Because this event wasn't just any gathering. It included journalists, politicians, public figures, people who have either experienced political violence or reported on it for years. And yet, despite the seriousness of the situation, the response afterward felt strangely polished. Almost like nothing really happened. Almost like the chaos had been smoothed out into a clean headline. And this is where critics started speaking up, because they noticed a pattern, a familiar one: access over accountability. In simple terms, some journalists are more focused on maintaining relationships with powerful figures than challenging them. Because access means interviews. Interviews mean visibility, and visibility means influence. But at what cost? Think about the moment at the end of the interview again. After being called a disgrace, after being interrupted repeatedly, Norah O'Donnell thanks the president, appreciates him, encourages future events. And that moment felt off to many viewers, because it didn't match the tone of what just happened. It felt like a reset, a quick shift from confrontation to courtesy. And that's where people started questioning, is this real journalism or performance? But let's go deeper, because this isn't just about one interview or one journalist. It's about a system, a cycle, where powerful figures push narratives, media amplifies them, and the public is left trying to figure out what's real. Now let's talk about something even more serious. The issue that was almost completely overshadowed by all this noise: gun violence. Because while everyone was focused on the interview drama, something much bigger was happening in the background. A reality that doesn't stop for headlines, doesn't pause for interviews, and doesn't wait for political debates. According to statements made by Jamie Raskin, hundreds of people are affected by gun violence every single day in the United States. Hundreds. And many of them don't get national attention. No headlines, no primetime interviews, no viral moments, just silence. And that's what makes this situation even more powerful. Because while a high-profile event gets all the attention, the everyday reality continues, unchanged, unresolved, ignored. During the interview, when Trump was asked about political violence, this was a moment to address that reality, a moment to connect the dots, to acknowledge the pain, to propose solutions. But instead, the response shifted again. Blame was redirected. Responsibility was moved. And the conversation became political. Now here's the problem with that. When every issue becomes about us versus them, nothing gets solved. Because the focus isn't on fixing the problem, it's on winning the argument. And that's where frustration starts to build. Not just among critics, but among everyday people watching all of this unfold. Because from the outside, it starts to look like a cycle. Something serious happens. Attention shifts to controversy. Controversy turns into debate. Debate turns into division. And then, nothing changes. And this is exactly why moments like this matter. Because they reveal how the system works. Not just in theory, but in real time. Now let's go back to the dinner one more time. Because there's something else that stood out. Something that didn't get enough attention. The idea of security solutions. After the incident, there were discussions about increasing security, expanding perimeters, adding more protection. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But here's the question. Does more security solve the root problem, or does it just contain it? Because if the solution to violence is simply building stronger walls, then what happens outside those walls? What happens in schools, in communities, in everyday life? This is where critics argue that the focus is misplaced, because instead of addressing causes, the system reacts to consequences, and that's a cycle that never ends. So now we're left with multiple layers of this story: an explosive interview, a chaotic event, a media response that raises questions, and a deeper issue that remains unresolved. But here's where things take another turn, because the public reaction to all of this was not what many expected. People didn't just accept the narrative, they started pushing back. They started analyzing clips, breaking down statements, comparing what was said to what was seen. And that's when the story started evolving. Because in today's world, the audience is no longer passive. They don't just watch, they investigate, they question, they challenge,